Hello, my name is Shaylin Garay,
I'm Naomi Gwynn.
and we are representing the Alliance for Positive Youth Development, or APYD. APYD is a sister group initiative that connects and supports those who dedicate their careers to youth development. We raise awareness of social issues that affect the nation's youth and share effective strategies to sustain positive youth impacts through giving back, defending against oppression, and empowering initiatives. We will be addressing the issue of equity in education, how COVID has impacted this justice, where we are at, where we have been, and where we are going. COVID has turned the world upside down forever as we know it, and especially for youth who are just beginning to navigate life. Most active play and exercise areas have closed. Families and children and households have had to isolate themselves, and the public school system has drastically changed in order to help abide by social distancing and quarantine regulations. Most schools at the start of the pandemic began remote and virtual learning. Next month will be 1 year since the President of the United States declared a national emergency because of the coronavirus. 1 year later, since that, some schools have started hybrid programs where students spend a combination of learning in person and online, and a small number of schools have resumed full in-person learning, but with regulations like social distancing and wearing face coverings, smaller class sizes, and in order to limit the cross-contamination between different groups of kids. And they've also drastically increased their sanitation practices. School systems will forever be changed, and they were not prepared for this dramatic shift. In the United States, 93% of students have participated in virtual learning in some way since the pandemic has began. Participating in virtual learning means that you have to use technology to attend class and communicate with teachers. You also use technology to complete all your assignments and also access educational resources that you traditionally got when kids were in person learning at school. 7.5 million US students do not have access to technology that they need for virtual learning, which is essential. Since the pandemic began, 50% of K through 8th grade children have reported that they are experiencing headaches, anxiety, and stress and exhaustion due to education. Youth are struggling right now due to the extra stressors and differences that they're experiencing. And the access to equity and quality education is becoming affected harshly, especially for Black, Hispanic, Native, and low income students. So we have to ask ourselves, how can we help the generation of future leaders? First, we must look at the history and what's happened so far.
Educational inequity did not just happen. It's not an accident that there's such a significant discrepancy between the quality of education provided to low-income students and to students of color versus wealthy white individuals. So there's been several court cases over the US history that we'll discuss today that will help us have a better understanding of what exactly has shaped our current education system that has provided room for this inequality to thrive. So one of the first major cases that we'll discuss today is Brown v. Board of Education. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that segregated schooling was unconstitutional. And so for civil rights activists, this was a huge victory because it was supposed to make it so that schools that previously had been for white only or Black only children would be able to integrate and theoretically allow for people of color to be able to share in the same quality education that white students had previously enjoyed. And school systems were ordered to integrate nationwide. However, just a short year later in 1954, the Supreme Court then ruled that schools should be ordered to integrate with, quote, all deliberate speed. And so using this wording was very strategic. There were no deadlines that were given to school districts, and there were really no consequences that were provided to school districts who declined to integrate their student bodies. So this left Brown 1 essentially nothing but a symbolic ruling. From 1954 to 1965, every year there was at least one major instance of violence against people of color. Now, there were hundreds and hundreds of other smaller instances, but at least once per year, there were major instances such as bombings of people's homes, of churches and schools. People were lynched, shot, and stabbed. They were beaten, and all of these things were in an effort from white supremacists to prevent schools from being integrated. In addition to acts of violence, there were also many instances of intimidation and hostility. So during that same time frame, people of color who registered to vote or who enrolled their children in primarily white school systems with the hopes of being able to promote integration of education were often evicted from their homes, they were threatened, they were fired from their jobs, and all of these things and oftentimes forced families to relocate to other communities and very much disrupted their home lives and the process of integrating into school systems. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination based on race, color, ethnicity, religion, or sex. And this also ended an 1896 law called Plessy v. Ferguson that had legalized segregated schools and voting restrictions. So the Civil Rights Act was a major victory. And this essentially made it so that any type of segregated school based on any of the protected statuses mentioned above was now illegal on a national basis. But then in 1972, as our economy was struggling, there were certain communities that were experiencing intense hardships. And our school systems, up until that point, which is still the case today, were largely funded by local property tax dollars. Property tax dollars depend on the value of the homes in the area and are almost always much more for families that are wealthy and live in very high income areas, whereas opposed to rural or low income areas, property taxes will be very low. So in San Antonio Schools v. Rodriguez, there was a community that was really struggling to be able to compensate for their community's education, and they felt that it was a constitutional right for students to be entitled to a quality education regardless of what was going on in their communities around them. But the Supreme Court ruled that students' education funding is not a constitutional right. So this essentially made educational inequity the law of the land. Then in 1974, in Milliken v. Bradley, the Supreme Court ruled that if school district lines were established for any reason, it did not matter if this was strategically to keep low-income families or people of color in a certain area, the reasoning behind school district lines being drawn was ruled to be irrelevant, and that once those school district lines were established for any reason, the school districts were not required to then promote and push integration efforts to cross those boundaries. So this essentially made it so that segregated school districts based on ethnicity, race, socioeconomic status were completely legal in the United States without any repercussions. These systems were designed to oppress. They were strategic and they were targeted to oppress people of color and oppress low-income individuals and families. And so other tactics such as gerrymandering, redlining, and continuing funding schools from local property taxes have created a system that hurts those that are most vulnerable. Gerrymandering is a practice of ensuring that district lines and boundaries, whether it is for voting or for school districts or even cities and communities, so incorporated cities that have access to more funding than more rural areas, manipulating those boundaries to keep low-income individuals and people of color as the minority. Minority is not just necessarily a numerical value, it is also a symbol of power. And so these systems were designed to keep power in the hands of white individuals and wealthy individuals and uphold practices that had been in place under segregation. Redlining was another practice used to oppress vulnerable individuals. People of color were denied services, so whether that was financial, such as mortgages, business loans, or otherwise, based on the color of their skin. And this kept them from accessing funding and resources that white individuals used to help them grow their wealth and grow their businesses. This created the wealth gap. So it made it so that while many white people were succeeding and experiencing a large amount of financial growth, buying their first homes and their first businesses and investing into their local communities, people of color were denied and cut off from all of those opportunities. And this allowed white people to accumulate wealth at a much higher rate than people of color. This all ties into systemic racism, and the impact of these practices are still very much felt today. So while practices like redlining are illegal, the effects that they've had on our nation and on individuals even generations later are still very much felt. and it has led to the average white family in the US owning 10 times the amount of wealth of the average Black or brown family. The impacts of gerrymandering and redlining have also still been felt in school districts and are very intense. Over half of US students still attend racially segregated or racially concentrated schools today. The unequal funding system created under allowing local property taxes to be a key source of funding for communities has made it so that individuals who live in wealthy areas and have large homes and high property values are able to enjoy benefits with technology, with high qualified teaching staff, with sports facilities and buildings, with all the benefits that a school system can offer, while low income rural areas and inner cities where people are low income or people of color are often struggling to simply keep up with building maintenance, such as electricity or mold concerns under control, to have staff in the building at all, much less high qualified staff. And it has significantly impacted the quality of student education. Today, schools with primarily white students receive an average of $2,226 more per student than schools that have primarily students of color. And this discrepancy has huge implications on how school systems are able to serve the children in their district and what they're able to do as far as providing a quality education.
Inequity in education has always existed, and COVID has made all these issues worse. Today, students nationwide are struggling academically, emotionally, physically, mentally, and socially. COVID has furthered these barriers in technology. It has also created barriers for youth to receive the support that public schools provide, and it has also created a decrease in privacy and increase in stress levels. COVID did not begin the digital divide, but amplified it in the K through 12 public education system. Lack of reliable technology for students, especially those living in rural areas and those of low income, and students of color were most affected. Serious consequences result from inadequate technological resources. 11 million US students do not have access to the computers needed for virtual learning. And 3.7 million US students don't have access to internet at home at all. 59% of low-income students report experiencing technical difficulties during virtual learning. And 1 in every 4 low-income students report being unable to complete their assignments for school due to technological errors and difficulties. On average, all K through 12th grade students have lost 7 months of learning and academic progress since the start of the pandemic. However, students of color are experiencing between 8 to 12 months of lost learning and progress, an average of 10 months, with Black youth experiencing the most loss. The digital divide has caused serious and long-term consequences for students, especially those without adequate, reliable resources to access their education now. Research found that the months of academic loss that will affect students' grades, they will also decrease the grade retention, increase dropout rates. In 2020, fewer high school graduates went to college right after graduating in order to help their families out economically due to loss in finances because of the pandemic. This has long-term and serious consequences on the economy and youth's careers and their future.
Access to support is another key element to promote student success, especially during virtual learning. When students are at home, they need supervision, they need support, and they need positive reinforcement in order to stay on task, to complete their assignments, and to be able to keep themselves organized. Students of color are 50% likely than their white peers to have access to any type of live meetings with their teachers. So part of this is due to funding concerns, and a lot of it has to do with lack of technology access, as we discussed with the digital divide, where students of color are less likely to have internet access and less likely to have access to devices that support virtual sessions and allow them to have that as close to in-person as students are able to get during virtual learning, where they're able to have conversations with their teachers and ask questions and receive that feedback on assignments. Only 30% of US workers are able to work from home, which also significantly impacts the level of support that students are able to get with virtual learning. And for people of color, that number is much lower. Only 16% of Black, Brown, and Indigenous caregivers are able to work from home. And so what this means is that working parents, either for their older children, they may be home alone during the day for periods of time. And for younger children, they must find childcare. So that might look like a childcare center, or for people that are especially struggling financially, their children may spend the school day with friends or with relatives in potentially crowded homes. And this impacts significantly comprehension, focus, and motivation to complete assignments. Grades are struggling, and it's also increased negative mental health systems. Students often feel very much alone, especially if they are home alone for long periods during the day. That social isolation can be very detrimental to student well-being and growth. Privacy is another concern that I briefly mentioned. When all students, even people whose parents or caregivers are able to work from home, if they have siblings or if there are multiple other adults living and working in the home, that can cause disruption. School teachers are very purposeful in ensuring that their students have a quiet, calm environment, but home life is often very different for many students, especially those that are low income. And having pets, other siblings, or perhaps their parents that are able to stay home, or caregivers are helping with childcare for a relative or a friend or neighbor, there's a lot of chaos that occurs in the home environment that is outside of a child's control. And this makes focus especially challenging. Students with special needs and IEPs have seen the sharpest impact from this, as focusing for them is difficult anyway on many scales. And so focusing in an environment that's filled with chaos and changes and uncertainties can be extremely intense and overwhelming.
Changes in education and life because of COVID has had serious mental health impacts on youth. Of all the K through 12th grade youth that receive mental health services, 57% of those students receive those services from their school. And since COVID, that means 57% of youth have faced barriers in accessing this critical care. 50% of K through 12th youth have reported an increase in stress, anxiety, headaches, exhaustion, and stomach aches since COVID, which can severely affect their academic progress and their socio-emotional skill development. There's been a 28% increase in ER visits for kids ages 5 to 17 since the start of the pandemic. It's time to do something to help kids cope with the changes that they face and the inequality and inequity in education that restricts the most in-need youth from receiving support and equal opportunity. So where do we start? There are actions that you can take individually to help form big changes. Organization can be provided to help youth reduce stress, and by helping students learn how to prioritize and focus, they can have time to access their current educational resources. And we can emphasize positive moments, especially in this time of need. Youth need to feel empowered and supported. Spending quality time with the youth in your life during these uncertain times is crucial, and as well as promoting positive mental health. And support matters. Giving students a safe place to express and process their feelings can help decrease stress and anxiety and increase socio-emotional skills. See if your school is offering any virtual counseling services for students that are not in person, that for schools that aren't in in-person learning, or connect to the community resources that are now in place to compensate for the lost public education resources. This can help youth learn how to have new coping skills and manage their daily stress in and out of learning.
So there are other ways that we can help. So let's take a look at the big picture. Addressing these issues on a larger scale is critical to making changes not only for individual communities, but for our nation as a whole. So some key elements of those changes that need to occur lie in increasing funding in targeted areas. So not just blanket financial increases to school districts, but providing funding for specific programs, specific resources, and key things that school districts need in order to promote educational equity is very important. Reimagining what school systems look like and prioritizing diversity and inclusion and equity in making those changes. We need to start holding people accountable for the policies that are in place and for their actions and also lack of actions. The inaction that has occurred as far as addressing educational equity is extremely alarming. And so having a form of accountability for those in power and advocating for youth is essential. And finally, there are many organizations in place that are working to address the concerns that we've mentioned, but they need your support. We need to invest in organizations at a local level and a national level and help promote those organizations that are working to bring positive changes. So first place to start would be increasing in funding. Additional staff members are going to be needed post-COVID. They will allow students to receive more individualized experiences with their education. But even while school districts are still remote, we're finding that the trying for teachers to try and touch base with their students and have those virtual sessions and provide students with help and with questions has been very challenging. So expanding staff in school districts to help them have a smaller class size and a smaller class load, or have supportive staff to help teachers for students with questions. Students are going to need tutoring and more classroom aids with the significant amount of knowledge loss and progress loss academically that has occurred since the pandemic. They're going to need additional support to help close that achievement gap. Technology is another key element that needs to be invested in. The digital divide is a very real and very serious issue. And so investing funds into technology to assure that every student has access to up-to-date technology, not just any computer, but computers that work, that are compatible with video conferencing and with the technology that they need to succeed. Improving access to high-speed internet to also foster those video sessions that are needed. And essential trainings in things like coding and computer science, which is another area that many students in low-income and rural areas don't have exposure to, that will help close the achievement gap, and it will help better prepare students to graduate more equipped for successful careers. As students return to in-person learning, they're depending on adults to keep them safe, and it's up to all of us to ensure that there are policies in place and resources that schools need in order to keep students and staff members safe. So safety being a key priority, there are also elements of that take funding. So whether it's hand sanitizer and cleaning products, thermometers to check student temperatures, disposable masks to help students that might forget theirs or theirs broke or their family can't afford to buy new ones. And also providing funding for extra payroll hours, for additional janitorial staff and other things that are needed to keep the school clean and sanitized and to keep the learning environment safe.
Many students have suffered trauma from social isolation, stress at home, loss, and other negative effects of COVID. By increasing funding for all schools and to increase the equity in education, this can provide better counseling services to those students in need. Right now, 8.7 million students in the US attend schools with no counselor on staff. Prior to COVID, 90% of schools failed to meet the recommended standards for mental health professionals per student ratio. In addition to changes from COVID-19, Black youth specifically must cope with additional stressors caused by higher rates of illness, poverty, violence, and discrimination than their white peers. Police brutality and the results of trauma on Black youth can add further stress and feelings of hopelessness. After the murders of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, the protests of summer 2020 increased awareness and momentum for the Black Lives Matter movement, and it sparked important conversations regarding policy and police use of force. The constant stress surrounding these issues weighs heavily on Black youth. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for Black youth. And Black youth ages 5 to 19 have seen a 73% increase in suicide rates, more than any other demographic. Despite the severity and need of support, Black youth are less likely to receive mental health services than white youth due to the many barriers that are rooted in the stigma and systematic racism. 80% of students who need mental health services do not receive them due to lack of available community resources. Students in all are 20 times more likely to visit school-based mental health services for help rather than community-based mental health services. And since COVID, school-based mental health services have been limited or inaccessible for many students. By increasing funding and investing in mental health, um, we must have this in the long term in order for education equity to exist. If public schools receive additional funding to hire mental health professionals and counselors, students will have more access to trauma-informed care, and it will increase their well-being and help their academic success in futures. We don't have to wait for schools to be back in session to initiate these changes. These services can be offered to students in person and virtually, to those who do have internet connection.
Another key change that needs to occur is reimagining what school systems look like in our country. Part of that has to do with funding changes. So in order to bridge the gap from the educational equity that occurs from local property values, where low-income students in lower income areas receive a much less quality education than students in higher income areas with high property taxes, we have to remove this funding from the equation. This source of funding is very discriminatory, and there needs to be a balance and compensation at a federal level and a state level to help provide students with equitable educational standards. So we must create standards that ensure that the financial support that is needed for students is available to all communities. Diversity is very important. Policy changes at a federal level need to occur to hold school districts accountable for the levels of diversity that they have. So the legislation that we discussed earlier that made it legal for students to establish district lines for any reason needs to change. We need to create standards that allow for contribution from local stakeholders, because yes, communities should have somewhat of a say in where their children go to school and what that looks like to help create an individualized plan, since variances from one community to another are extremely different. But those need to align with a federal minimum standard that sets a bar and a very distinct standard for how diversity must occur within school districts to help promote and increase it. There are many benefits to students who attend racially integrated school systems. It helps reduce the achievement gap because students from integrated schools have higher test scores and higher graduation rates. And they're also more likely to go on to college after they graduate from high school. And graduating from high school and attending college helps to increase their future earning potentials and many contributions to the economy. They also have higher critical thinking and problem solving skills and have been shown to have higher levels of creativity. And part of why that is because students in integrated schools are exposed to many different cultures and individual people. So they have to learn how to work together as a team, to hear other people's points of view, and to be able to get input and see things that are different, but to understand that within differences there can also be many strengths. And it helps also prepare them to be better teammates on a professional level when they grow up. They've also been shown to have reduced levels of racial bias and stereotypical beliefs. And from a mental and physical health perspective, students who attend racially integrated schools have also been shown to have reduced rates of overall anxiety, higher levels of self-esteem, and higher general levels of health. Diversity in staff is also extremely important. So diversifying the student body is a key change that needs to occur, but staff diversity is also essential. Only 20% of public school teachers in the US are people of color, and only 30% of school teachers are male. Diversity is essential for all students, and all students have been shown to benefit from having a diverse ethnicity in their teachers. But for students of color, this is especially important. It allows them to see themselves as represented in positive and professional roles. And for white students, it allows them to see people of color in those roles and promote respect and reduce implicit bias as far as the careers and business images that people of color have for those students. It also better equips students of color to increase their performance, because studies have shown that teachers of color are more likely to hold students of color to a higher academic and behavioral standard. They also have reduced rates of implicit bias that potentially negative impact their experiences and interactions with students of color. This helps decrease excessive discipline, which studies have shown has a huge factor in the school to prison pipeline. and it also increases student self-esteem. Studies have shown that of all the demographics that are impacted by positively having teachers of color, that this is most impactful for Black male students from low-income households. Having just one Black teacher over the course of their 12 years in school increases their likelihood of enrolling in college after graduation by as much as 39%.
We also must hold policymakers accountable to initiate this change. The 2020 election brought a record number of the highest eligible voter participation ever, at 66.2% of those that are eligible voted. And voter engagement provides power to individuals to support policymakers in legislation that aligns with voter values and priorities. If eligible voter participation reaches 100%, policymakers will represent the communities fully, especially in communities that are traditionally experiencing voter suppression. This happens most in Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous communities, which are the communities that experience the most inequity in the youth in public education systems, resources, and opportunities. If schools prioritize civic engagement in their curriculums, all students will receive equal and equitable access to education on the political system. They're aware of their voting rights and can make informed decisions when they are eligible to vote. Those of voting age must participate in local, federal, and state elections to support the candidates and policies that prioritize creating educational equity. You can also contact your local and state representatives to advocate for change. Share your thoughts, your opinions, and your beliefs regarding specific policies and social issues that are affecting you and your community to help initiate change and hold them accountable. Advocacy is possible in many different ways, a variety of ways. By monitoring current events and legislation, positive changes can occur at the policy level and awareness increases for injustices and inequalities. By attending meetings virtually or in person, you can be an advocate for educational equity at the local, state, and national levels.
Another key element that can bring about change is providing support to your community, to each other, and especially to organizations working to bring change. This can occur through contribution by giving financially to organizations that you believe in. When their mission and their vision and what they are working towards aligns with things that you would like to see occur, then it's important to understand that changes in a lot of ways require financial support. And so being sure that when you are able and if you are able to contribute strategically to organizations, especially those that promote educational equity and social justice. Promoting those organizations in other ways is also essential. Raising awareness about their mission, vision, and the work that they're doing through social media and through verbal conversations with people in your area and community can help spread awareness and promote them to help them even further with bringing changes. Raising awareness about ideas is also very important. When you see things that you feel like need to change, it's important to reflect on what can be different, to have those important conversations with the people within your social circle, on social media, and in other areas that can help ideas feed off of each other. They can grow and they can be spread and help bring change by engaging other people and helping them to be aware, hey, this is an issue and this is something important that we need to work to change. A final way that you can help support organizations is by volunteering. You can volunteer by going door to door to help spread awareness on specific community issues or with voting. That's another important way that people get involved during the voting season. Another way is to volunteer your time to virtually support organizations by making phone calls or composing and sending emails or answering questions that people have for the organization. Contributing and donating your time is a very important resource for organizations and can help them tremendously. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you have any questions regarding the content in this webinar or about educational equity or APYD's mission, please contact us at apydcon@cisggroup.org. This has been our Equity in Education webinar, reflecting on education and COVID. I'm Naomi Gwynn.
And I'm Shaylin Gray.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Join the conversation at #equity in education and follow us for more on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And check out our blog and website, notenoughgood.com, for more information. Thank you.
Thank you.